excited to present our keynote speaker now, Mueni Rudd from Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity. Mueni is a Kenyan-American scholar advocate with years of experience in racial justice, social activism, and evaluative research. In this talk, Mueni will explore approaches to supporting human-animal well-being, specifically among racially diverse people. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate your patience. Was having some issues with that link, but I'm glad we got to hear from the other speaker and glad to still have time. Ladies, I think I shared my PDF with you via email. If you all would share that, I would prefer it.
Yes, please give us a couple of seconds. Thank you.
No problem. And maybe I'm late, but if folks haven't said where they're from, I'd love to see in the chat where folks are all over the world. I'm in Austin, Texas. Oh, wow. We definitely have a wide range of folks and some Texas folks for sure. All right, ladies. Well, if you guys want to make that as big as you can, I'll let you know when to go to the next slide. So again, my name is Mueni Rudd. I am happy to join you here from CARE. And this will actually be a paper presentation. Next slide, please. So for folks who are not familiar with CARE, we are Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity. We're based in Baltimore, Maryland, but are doing work throughout the country, and my colleagues are spread out across the continental US. So our main mission is to be in the interest of human and animal well-being, prioritizing and amplifying BIPOC and other marginalized voices using narratives, research, and community-centered investments. Please check us out after this. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of the paper presentation. This is what you'll be hearing about. This is what I'll be diving into. Next slide, please. So my colleague Johnny and I wrote this paper together, and both of us are very fortunate to be able to be sharing this work around the country. So today he won't be joining us, but I did want to acknowledge his contributions and effort. Next slide, please. So I'll begin kind of the lengthier, talkier part of this presentation, but I'm excited to have question and answers after. So a shift in animal welfare approaches has centered more attention on the human-animal bond between diverse people and other animals. Scientific curiosity into the significance of these bonds is led by prestigious academic research institutions and organizations like the Human Animal Bond Research Institute. Although interdisciplinary study into the phenomenon has become prevalent, animal bond disparities between historically excluded populations persist. CARE argues for social scientists and animal welfare researchers to probe further into the human-animal relationship critically through race, ethnicity, class, sex, and gender frameworks to reimagine a welcoming and inclusive sector for marginalized communities. Historically, police brutality within communities of color has been broadly documented. George Floyd's death in May 2020 served as a catalyst to ignite a global call and response for racial equity and justice. Likewise, animal welfare in the United States has responded with countless DEI-centered discussions and initiatives. Earlier in 2020, CARE, the country's first Black-led animal welfare organization, was founded to prioritize inclusion as a key tool in life-saving for human and animal well-being. Community participatory research and personal storytelling are key to examining the impact of disparities in animal welfare. However, two challenges persist. BIPOC people remain notably absent, while perception of tokenism, colorism, and texturism slant the national dialogue towards white fragility as opposed to BIPOC-centered solutions to increase inclusion within our sector. Nevertheless, these conversations continue as an essential discourse to healing the racial divide across all sectors, including our own. CARE focuses on comprehensive human and animal well-being through the pursuit of community wisdom that will drive life-saving activities in marginalized communities I've mentioned. Doing so requires adopting transformative justice principles into human and animal well-being, resulting impact of more welcoming, culturally competent, and responsive spaces for BIPOC communities within animal welfare. We must expand the narrow notion of well-being to include critical justice issues like gender and sexual diversity, racial equity, economic and housing security, disability rights, and environmentalism. Next slide, please. Disability justice may appear to be the notable outlier in much of justice advocacy and studies. Inaccessibility can easily be described as one of the most impactful barriers to disability justice. Divesting from that requires intellectually and physically disabled populations to be visible and centered in the movement toward inclusive social justice. Scholar advocates like Racial Disabled Women of Color Unite urge for critical intersectional disability studies approaches that prioritize the meeting of race, gender, class, and disabilities. Disabled lived experience with systems of oppression essentially provide increased validity to justice advocacy frameworks across interdisciplinary and cross-sector approaches. Animal welfare does outwardly appear to be in agreement with the utilization of service animals. Despite this, the fight for emotional support service animals to be legitimized continues for people living with a disability and requiring this form of support. Current federal legislation does not define emotional support service animal training as work or a task for the animal, ignoring the direct feedback from disabled communities. Legislation supporting communities with visual impairments and their service animals reveals bias and lack of disabled community involvement in policy creation. This is merely only one example of the lack of commitment to cross-disability solidarity at the intersection of disability justice and animal well-being. Ableism is as normative to our society as colonial whiteness. Reimagining disability justice for animal and human well-being challenges advocates like CARE to create a culture of access and the outputs to our communities. Disability justice advocacy is most simply placing value on the advancement of equitable access practices despite the lack of societal buy-in from individuals, institutions, and the government. Next slide, please. Climate experts like Dr. Anaya Johnson acknowledge the environmental justice movement improves by being interconnected to race and class liberation work. This requires environmental justice support and solutions to be centered around minoritized communities in order to be sustainable models. If we think of environmental racism as an extension of harmful state-sanctioned practices, then we can more effectively theorize it as a form of state violence. The largely white Western environmental movement is not prioritizing racially diverse communities. BIPOC populations are disproportionately exposed to environmental racism like proximity to highway landfills, chemical facilities, or toxic waste, for example. The associated health risks like cancer or asthma impact the humans and other animals in those communities. Animal advocates must consider combining efforts with related human service organizations to improve services to all. Environmental scholars like Dr. Pello continues on that environmental justice with critical environmental justice studies combined seek to expand the field of environmental justice to move beyond its conceptual or theoretical limitations. His approach draws from numerous fields of scholarship to produce more robust arguments, resulting in the examination of the persistent occurrence of environmental injustices that are impacting humans and non-humans. Notably, the approach offers animal welfare an opportunity to reimagine old paradigms through intersectional theory to define new strategies for BIPOC community engagement and coalition building. The promise of critical environmental justice studies lies in its capacity to explain the sources and consequences of our socio-ecological crisis and develop more generative analysis of how social change efforts within and across species may meet those challenges more fully. Issues of environmental racism, like communities of colors and their animals' disproportionate exposure to health risks, food deserts, or proximity to toxic facilities and environmental hazards, can be more easily understood using environmental justice frameworks to reimagine deliberate support. It is not in the intent of me or Johnny to ever seem that we are not presenting this as a human-animal relationship argument. Instead, the desire is to improve what critical animal studies hopes to do by centering the needs and lived experiences of historically oppressed humans who have companion animals for the purpose of keeping those relationships sufficiently supported. Next slide, please. Although animal welfare has embraced research that examines the human-animal bond, the sector has only scratched the surface to use the knowledge as addressing disparities and inequities experienced specific by LGBTQ communities. Further extension into sexualized communities is likely to elucidate even more fertile research and program design that cater to their unique challenges. In order to engage such challenges, animal welfare researchers must embrace immersive critical research, rigor, and practice that fearlessly intersects animal welfare with race, sexuality, and gender. Many authors underscore how transgender, non-binary, and other sexual minorities who experience social stigma value non-judgmental acceptance and love from companion pets. Additional research from the National Health, Aging, and Sexuality Association demonstrates that sexual and gender minorities in midlife or after have increased risks for disability, poor health, and depression. Nonetheless, uncharted opportunities remain for all of us to find solution-oriented, community-based programs to address the isolation and other experiences we see from aging sexual minorities and all LGBT communities within the BIPOC community. Next slide, please. Critical race scholars suggest that harm reduction and equitable societal progression surrounding race cannot exist without the acknowledgement of racialized lived experiences. Racial justice studies promote frameworks that value the differences in institutional, structural, interpersonal, and internalized racism to effectively reimagine equity efforts for non-white populations' quality of life. It is vital to humanize these experiences in racial justice work across sectors, including our own, by recognizing racial trauma's impact on the individual and their communities. A race-based traumatic impact can present itself in increased aggression, suspicion, sensitivity to threats, psychological symptoms, drug usage or abuse, or a narrowing sense of time. Some authors do clarify that critical race theory does not need to work alone in reimagining equitable approaches. Therefore, there is a healthy argument for the intersectional relationship race and other systems of oppressions mentioned in this discussion have on building equitable frameworks of justice for support for humans and their animals. The racially diverse individuals and families served by animal welfare require sensitivity and trust-building components that honor their lived experiences. Additional modifications to practices are required for racially diverse individuals who also experience intersection of poverty or economic hardship and even gender or sexual differences. CARE had the privilege of having a Harvard IMPLICIT study which identified significant negative attitudes towards racially diverse, specifically Black and poor animal owners within animal welfare sectors. In addition, the study collected demographic data that supports the casual narrative that animal welfare is predominantly white run and operated. This disproportionate representation in the field dictates the type of services and approaches prioritized, and the lack of centrality in equity or justice to establish animal welfare as a welcoming place for BIPOC communities, especially intersectional BIPOC communities. Next slide. This is just some of that breakdown of the test we did with Harvard. Next slide. Although non-white communities in animal welfare are subjected to harmful practices, there are differences in treatment between people of color by white authority and leadership in animal welfare. Some authors argue that the surface level grouping of white and non-white can be very harmful due to the very different racialized lived experiences non-white people have. Reimagining and co-creating racial justice for human and animal well-being requires divesting from the current monolithic perspectives that we see in the research. Animal welfare has an opportunity to evolve by acknowledging the intersectional realities of BIPOC lived experiences and to support comprehensive human and animal well-being ethically and respectfully. Next slide. Just some of the demographics we gathered from those tests. Next slide, please. Little research is available to provide an explanation to why animal welfare scholars, advocates, practitioners, and grant makers maintain such small data specific to people of color. The University of Michigan Health recently published a study to better understand the needs for companion care, animal care for individuals requiring hospitalization. Despite these studies' ability to generate discussion on access to emergency boarding and companion animal fostering, there appears to be a lack of prioritization of racial diversity by these researchers and others. For example, their report stated that race and ethnicity was initially categorical, but due to low frequency of responses of those 7 categories that were non-white, it was dichotomized. This is very harmful to racially diverse communities that own companion animals for a few reasons. The researchers that I've given an example of bulk all BIPOC individuals into one as a convenience that inherently tells animal welfare sector that experiences are either white or non-white. This is seen as a erasure of complex racial experiences because not all non-white experiences are the same. Additionally, the authors state for this example that 62% of their sample pool identified as white. When animal welfare references published articles like the mentioned study to support programming, they are, whether or not they realize it or not, prioritizing white experiences and needs to inform their work. Monolithic approaches to reporting racial diversity, lack of clear race or ethnic breakdowns, and significantly small sample pools of people of color contribute to harm in our field and continue to occur. A query that explores the historical impact of the concept of race neutrality within animal welfare is also worthy of examination. Floyd's death elucidated the need for more scholarly research and grassroots data collection within the Academy, National Animal Welfare Organization, veterinary practices, and animal grant makers. Additionally, research is needed that provides an extensive analysis of the human-animal bond between intersectional BIPOC communities that would benefit community-based program design and outreach. Once this research is inevitably pursued, researchers should still practice due diligence to ethically implement research methodologies that partner with partner and pay marginalized communities as participants as opposed to extracted subjects. Participatory action research methodologies are available that follow a social justice framework and negates the historical, harmful, and sometimes violent in nature ways that our BIPOC communities have been unethically extracted from. We argue, CARE and myself, argue that in order to build authentic relationships with intersectional BIPOC communities to holistically address the challenges that have been mentioned, and the ways that it impacts them and their pets requires the disruption of the status quo within animal welfare and benefits pets within marginalized communities. Next slide, please. These are some of the goals for CARE overall, for those that are interested. So we do aim to address organizational and personal biases within animal welfare. We aim to bring diverse voices to human and animal well-being while also advocating for a more inclusive path to pet adoption. We use evidence-based tools, narratives, and insights to inspire organizations to be more inclusive. And we identify sustainable solutions within communities to create transformative change, just to mention a few. Next slide, please. Just a few references if anyone did want this in PDF. You can go 3 down, please. Thanks to our sponsors who believe in our work. Next slide, please. So this is the end of the speaking portion. I'd love to get into Q&A, but I just want you guys to know that all the pictures that you saw in the presentation are our proximate leaders throughout the continental US. Right here, the woman with the Army hat is Bianca, who's doing amazing work with me and helping me conduct a community participatory research project in Atlanta next week in Bankhead. And so, you know, CARE is referencing work that we're doing, we're showing up and doing that work, and we're collaborating and paying and reimagining what reciprocity means. But I just wanted you guys to know that those faces are real people that we are impacting and that we are being impacted and learning from and deeply listening to. So I really appreciate you guys listening. Any questions?
Oh, thank you so much, Mueni.